have two roles within my job structure at the moment. One is that I'm a police motorcyclist, a traffic motorcyclist, and the other is that I'm a family liaison officer. A family liaison officer is a roads policing traffic officer who's been trained to do a number of things in relation to road death and serious accidents or collisions on the road. And my role as a family liaison officer is to deliver bad news to families and to look after those families and support those families throughout the following months or sometimes even year or so after a fatality or a serious accident. The main cause generally is the lack of care by moped riders. They very often treat mopeds as a secondary thing to their day. They're more interested in looking at their friends, looking at their mates, and less interested in concentrating on their riding. Because of the nature of a moped rider, generally they are 16 years of age, sometimes 17, but predominantly 16. They are classed as juveniles within the legal system, as I'm sure you're aware. So anytime we have interaction with moped riders, certainly with regard to education and enforcement, then we are required to work with their parents or guardians as well, because we have a duty to tell them what's going on. So if we catch anybody on a moped doing something wrong, we have a duty to tell their guardian and parents. We work closely with paramedics and the fire service at the scene of an accident, collision. And the reason we do that is twofold. And firstly, because we need to make sure that the best care is given to anybody who's injured at the scene of an accident, and the paramedics and fire service are aware that we'll support them in that role. And secondly, that we need to preserve any evidence that's seen. So we have to work with the fire service especially, so the evidence that we have at scenes isn't disregarded or moved or whatever, because that's extremely important for evidence gathering after the individuals have been treated at the scene.
The equipment we use in RTC very much depends on the injuries. Two main concerns, obviously spinal injuries. We're looking at collars, spinal board, maybe scoop, vacuum mattress, and catastrophic hemorrhage and major bleeding. So we'd have packs to deal with that and equipment to deal with that. Obviously, the first procedure, the first thing to think about is our safety. We need to be safe. So we think where we position our vehicle. Once we're happy that we're safe, we've got the appropriate equipment, we'll look at making the scene safe and looking at the patient, a quick assessment, what equipment we're going to need, what we're going to need to take into the scene. Obviously, as paramedics, we're all trained to the same standard. At the moment, it's a 2-year university programme, but we have ongoing training. There's developments going on at the moment with trauma care, looking at where patients go to receive the most appropriate care. To enable that to happen, the care at scene is important. And we're going through a process of updating all our staff on current practices and ensuring that they're up to speed on everything. At the scene of an accident, all the emergency services play an individual role. We've all got the same goal, and that's to preserve life.
As an accident investigator, my job is to go to the scene of a crash which is either serious or fatal, sadly, and to collect the data at the scene, measure the marks that may have been left by the motorcycle or moped as it skidded, tyre marks, anything there that might give us clues about how the accident has happened, what the causes were, and from there interview drivers that were involved and witnesses, and then come up with a full understanding of how an accident happened. Moped accidents are often caused by other drivers not seeing the moped coming. They're also caused quite often by the rider themselves reacting to something in an inappropriate or an emergency situation and not really understanding how the bike is going to react to that and ultimately losing control.
Being a police motorcyclist, I deal quite a lot with moped riders and scooter and motorcycle riders. And the two things I see that are a cause for a significant cause towards accidents or collisions and moped riders committing offences, the first one is riding far too close. Moped riders and scooter riders generally ride far too close in traffic in town, and they don't assess what's going on in front of them. And secondly, which is really my pet hate, one of my pet hates, is that they tend to always overtake on the zigzag approach to pedestrian crossings, which is extremely dangerous because even though the crossings may show green on the lights, you're not allowed to overtake in the zigzags, and some people will still try to get across the road, across the pedestrian crossing, and if a moped goes through or a motorcycle goes through, and it will hit them.
I think car drivers are particularly unaware of mopeds because they're so small, because they're usually in urban areas where spaces are confined and naturally are hidden by other vehicles, possibly other even pedestrians and things like that. So I think car drivers see mopeds very, with difficulty, basically. I think at night, although the bike's equipped with lights, they're not very big. Obviously, the battery systems on mopeds tend not to be as powerful as they are on bigger bikes, and physically they're quite small. Riders tend to wear dark clothing, using perhaps if they're at night, particularly going into town or something like that. So they're probably wearing clothing that they're going to then wear wherever they're going. So it tends to be dark, tends to be difficult to see. So night times are very awkward, I think, for moped riders. Yeah, on the way to an accident with a moped rider, it's thoughts of we're probably going to be dealing with a young person. It's concerns about how they are. If it's particularly bad, which it would be if we were going, then we'd be worried that potentially somebody's going to die, or they may have died already. And I think those thoughts are there for me, particularly as a parent, because I can understand how perhaps the parents of a rider involved in that would feel. And so I think it's particularly sad, actually, particularly sad, and it does affect you, even though you get used to going to accidents of that type. And when a young person's involved, I think it's always more difficult.
We're given specific information from our control room depending on the information that's given from the call at the scene. So it's very important that we get accurate information from the scene, and that decides or determines the information that we're given. Generally it's an RTC involving a motorbike or moped or car, or reasonably scarce to start off with. Obviously, if you think about cars, there's a lot around the driver in a car. There isn't with a motorbike or moped rider. So yeah, it is worrying. You think the worst. They've got no protection around them. So yeah, it does worry a bit.
Motorists, when I say that, car drivers and generally the older driving fraternity, sometimes give youngsters on mopeds a hard time when they've had an accident at the scene. They very often try to blame them. And unfortunately, because of the nature of youngsters and the way they are, and I have 2 children myself, so I know, they generally sometimes get a little bit flustered and a bit upset about it. And all I would say to youngsters is just stay calm, don't get upset, don't get angry, just stay calm at the scene and just try to placate things and let the police service and the ambulance service deal with it accordingly. It's not uncommon for people not to know what to do at an accident, because whilst there are still a lot of accidents on the road, not as common as perhaps they used to be. But the main thing I would say certainly to youngsters on mopeds is, the first thing is, if you've had an accident and you're not injured, just make sure you stay at the scene. Stay at the scene, make sure you phone the emergency services if they're needed, and make sure that you give anybody who needs your details.
The first thing to do, if you're thinking that you've got pain in your neck, that's a big problem. The last thing we want you to do is move. We need you to keep still. If it's your friend that's come off, or you come across an accident, you've got to think about safety. Safety is a big thing. The last thing we want is for you to become a patient as well. So you think about where you are, get off the side of the road, maybe waving the traffic down to stop them. Once it's safe, phone 999. We will give you advice over the phone on what to do on the next actions, and depending on what the scene is.
3 recent collisions come to mind. One in particular where a 16-year-old lad died as a result of looking behind him at one of his friends who was following on a left-hand bend and didn't realise he was going to the off side of the road. And unfortunately a bus on a routine bus journey was travelling the other direction, and he hit the front of the bus, went under the front of the bus, and unfortunately died. The second was in the dark, in town, on a lit road, where again a 16-year-old lad riding a moped, more interested in his friends behind him, and rode straight into the back of a stationary lorry, and as a result of that sustained severe injuries that he will live with for the rest of his life. And the last that I recall, again not far from here, a moped rider, again 16 years old, undertaking some stationary vehicles in a stationary line of traffic, travelling too fast for the conditions, and didn't realise that a car was turning across the path of the stationary vehicles in front of him into a garage forecourt, and he went straight into the side of this vehicle, and he was also severely injured. And they're just three of many, but the three that come to mind at the moment.
The accidents that stand out for me most are motorcycle related. Indeed, we've recently had 3 deaths related to motorcycle usage in Somerset, and each of those means something to me because I'm a motorcyclist myself and have been since 16, so I'm used to riding mopeds in the start and remember how that was and understand the difficulties for moped riders. And I think those for me are the ones usually the most difficult to deal with, because I guess you can empathise with the rider, understand what the difficulties that you have as a moped rider on the roads these days, but also the vulnerability and also the potential for injury when you fall off. And it's usually the images that come to mind are those of broken bones and other injuries that unfortunately motorcyclists suffer because they're more vulnerable, and when they fall off they'll hit something hard or solid, and the body's not designed to sustain that sort of impact. So it's quite common for motorcyclists to have broken bones, moped riders to suffer injuries from going under vehicles, and usually those cause trauma to the body, and they're very obvious to you when you attend the scene. And I think that those sorts of incidents, particularly the ones that stick in your mind.
It's the injuries that sort of, I suppose, stick to mind. I've seen sort of feet taken off where inappropriate footwear has been used. Lots of sort of lower leg injuries, again down to inappropriate protection. I wouldn't say there's one specific, but it's the general injuries that sort of stick in your mind. Obviously, the main injury with any sort of motorcycle type accident is neck injury and spinal injury, but specifically with mopeds, it's that lower leg injury, the sort of skin to bone injuries that we see.
Yes, I think it's the most difficult things I find when I've gone to a motorcycle or moped accident, indeed, are when you have broken bones, and they if they're compound and they're sort of complex by nature, quite often the bones have come through the skin, and they're also through the clothing, whether that's jeans or something less appropriate even. So and I find for myself that's the most unpleasant of accidents, and certainly of injuries. It's sort of, and it does stick with you actually. You find that you will have that image with you for some time afterwards.
If you think about in a car, you've got lots around you. On a moped or a motorbike, you haven't. It relies on appropriate clothing. You tend to see neglect around sort of appropriate trousers, appropriate footwear. And so when you come off your moped, jeans don't offer much protection. That soon disappears down to skin. And then from skin we go down through flesh, through muscle, and down to bone. So very painful injuries. Yeah, it's literally, as it says, degloving. If you imagine when you get off your moped, you take your gloves off. Imagine if you didn't have any gloves off and you took your skin off. That's probably the best way to explain it. Not nice.
Family liaison officer, specialist role. My job is to deliver bad news to families of people who've been killed on the roads. People don't want to see me at their front door because I bring to them life-changing experiences and news that in most cases they will live with for the rest of their lives. That said, we work with the families once we've delivered this message, and we support the families as family liaison officers in our force throughout the coming months, weeks, months, and in some cases a year or so, and support them through the processes that has to be gone through when somebody dies on the roads.